Dr. Ulises Granados, who will be the moderator of this session. Dr. Granados, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. So welcome to this panel, session 5, Security, Politics, and Diplomacy. Closer. Yeah, welcome to session 5, Security, Politics, and Diplomacy. Well, yesterday we had very fruitful discussions on the history, on the economic policies and economy, the PCA award, a huge discussion on that, international law. Today we will talk about high politics. So what are the strategies and policies of great powers, some non-claimant powers, countries? What does the South China Sea mean for the US, China, India, Japan, ASEAN as a group? What might be the security dilemmas here? How the South China Sea fits into the maritime strategies of all these countries? Are countries, claimant states involved, and non-claimant actors security maximizers or power maximizers, so to speak, in theory of international relations? Moreover, what is the centrality of ASEAN as a group here in this imbroglio? Is ASEAN unity shaking or not? So these are part of all these discussions we are having today. So let me welcome Mr. Abhijit Singh, Senior Fellow and Head of Maritime Security Initiative at the Observer Research Foundation of New Delhi in India. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Let me begin by saying that it is a distinct honor for me to be present here speaking to all of you. I'm going to be saying a few things about India's maritime strategy, India's maritime security policy in the South China Sea, and also parts of the Indian Ocean. I think it's best to first put on record that India looks at the South China Sea as a theater that is not peripheral, but contiguous to its interests. And most of the times when analysts from India actually speak about maritime security, there is an expectation that Indian analysts will talk will represent a non-claimant state. So there is this understanding that Indian analysts will try and be honest brokers, mediators. But I have to say that India does have interest in the South China Sea beyond just being an honest mediator. I thought it would be best to answer 3 questions about what India's stand in or what India's maritime policy in the South China Sea is. The first question that I'd like to talk about is the official stand as well as the practical, the realistic that Indian analysts have towards the South China Sea. The second question that I'm going to be looking at is India's maritime policy in Southeast Asia at large. What does India think about the US pivot to Asia? What are the basic fundamentals of India's look east or act east policy now? And how does India link the developments in the South China Sea with the politics of maritime Asia? India does realize that the questions of politics and what happens geopolitically in that region are linked to other questions of security in the wider maritime space. Now, India's official position on the South China Sea is really very, very basic, essential. It's a regular for a non-claimant state, and basically, India says that you need to have respect for the law and for the UNCLOS. There should be no use of force, and it also underlines the security of the SLOCs, freedom of navigation. It says unimpeded commerce is essential for all the states. So India is essentially underlining its economic stakes in the region. But if you look closely, there is really more to it than meets the eye. There is also a realist sense that While India's maritime policy is focused in the Indian Ocean region, it realizes that the South China Sea, that developments in the South China Sea may have an impact on what India's interests in the wider maritime Asia space are. And Indian maritime analysts don't like to look at the Eastern Indian Ocean and the South China Sea as two separate theaters. There is this sense that with time, the sort of challenges that both the areas face are quite similar, and that this is one space in which there should be a coherent and integrated maritime policy. And lastly, India realizes that what happens in the South China Sea does have a bearing on India's interests in the Indian Ocean region, which is why it is important for Indian policymakers to have ideas about how there can be greater peace in the South China Sea. This is three distinct reasons why the South China Sea matters for India. So for all of those that sometimes ask us questions saying that, why does India have to have a say in what happens in the South China Sea? Why is it that India is so such a big voice when it comes to the South China Sea? The reasons are as follows. There are huge economic stakes in what happens in littoral Southeast Asia. The fact of the matter is that close to about 55 to 60% of India's trade now flows through the Malacca Straits and the South China Sea. India has political aspirations in that region. What has happened is that in the past about a decade or so, India has risen as a power of with some political and military heft. It now sees itself as sitting on the global high table. It wants to be a rule shaper or a rule maker. And it realizes that it is not possible to do so if you're sitting on the fence all the time. So in the 80s and the 90s, the Indians used to sit on the fence. That has now changed. We have political aspirations. We realize that the world is looking at us to take a stand on maritime principles in the Indo-Pacific region, and therefore it's important for India to have a stake. And lastly, the power balance of the Asia-Pacific. India realizes that if the islands are captured or taken over by one side or the other in the South China Sea, that has a direct implication for what happens in the Indian Ocean. So for instance, if the Chinese were to strengthen their presence and consolidate their hold over the Spratlys and the Paracels, then there is almost an expectation that within a few years' time there will be great Chinese power projection in the Indian Ocean region. So what's the policy towards the South China Sea? Broadly, Indian policy to the South China Sea is not monolithical. It's not as if the Indians have made up their mind that this is what we are going to follow. There's a tussle between three views, and those three views are as follows. There's the nationalistic view, which used to be quite prevalent till about a decade ago, which said that we're non-aligned. We value our strategic autonomy, and therefore we will not get into any alliances. And the South China Sea really, in the telling of these experts, does not actually have a bearing on Indian interests. So this was an isolationist view. There are many sections in the political class and also many in the Indian Navy that subscribe to this view. There's the realist view. The realist view says that, well, and this is getting popular now, that these are cost-benefit maximizers. So they're always looking to strike deals. They are trying to maximize their positions, and they say the world is a bad place, and all sides are trying to maximize their own leverages, but we must also try and negotiate and try and move forward. So the realist view says that it is important for India to have a presence in the South China Sea. It is important for India to take a stand on issues in the South China Sea. It is important for India to take positions on matters of maritime principle, especially when it comes to some of the Chinese aggressive activities, both within the South China Sea and perceived activities in the Indian Ocean region. Finally, there is the globalist view, and this is really interesting. The globalists are increasingly getting more prominence in India. These are the people that argue for internationalism. They argue for globalization. We used to have a national security advisor called Shiv Shankar Menon till a few years ago. He was one of the leading thinkers, leading proponents of the globalist view, to say that we don't have a fight with either the US or China. We should look for ways in which we can maximize our interaction. And these are the people who say that it's a good idea to actually subscribe to the maritime Silk Route and other such proposals. Let's try and and build a partnership and gain more in terms of economics and in terms of general prosperity. Now, there is a certain hierarchy in the way the Indian Navy or the Indian naval forces used to look at security in the Indian Ocean region and the South China Sea, which is now sort of combined in India's thinking. Coastal security used to get a lot of prominence for many years, and especially after the 2008 Mumbai attacks, the coastal security was really the major thrust of India's security efforts. What happened after that is that by 2011, when there was the US pivot, and there was also greater Chinese aggression or assertiveness in the South China Sea. There was a move towards greater deterrence and regional presence operations, and also constabulary and benign. So what has happened really is that from the top of the pyramid, the policy seems to have shifted a wee bit to the bottom of the pyramid. So it is really a combination of 2 and 3, which is block number 2 and 3, which is now deterrence and presence operations and constabulary and benign presence in the Indian Ocean and in the South China Sea. That is the thrust of Indian thinking and Indian policy. Now, it is often said that there is a homogenization of security happening in the Indian Ocean region and the Pacific. In that this belief earlier that the Pacific was a theater of traditional security challenges, disputes between states, nation states, and the Indian Ocean region was a theater where you only saw non-traditional challenges like piracy and armed robbery and drug trafficking is changing. Increasingly, both theaters are beginning to resemble each other. This has happened because there's greater militarization happening on both sides. There is Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean region, as well as the US presence within the Indian Ocean region and the Pacific. And so both of the theaters are beginning to look similar, and also the proliferation of non-traditional threats. This is one of the things that most bothers Indian thinkers. It is the impact of Chinese naval operations in the Indian Ocean region, how that is going to affect the dynamic of security within the integrated Indo-Pacific space. And there is some worry that as Chinese submarines come into the Indian Ocean region, as there's greater littoral maritime operations happening in that space, there is the possibility of Indian geopolitical leverages being attenuated in the Indian Ocean region. So the Indian thinkers are clear that China's presence in the Indian Ocean region is not a direct threat to Indian security, but it in some ways does challenge India's maritime primacy in the Indian Ocean region. And how is this linked to the South China Sea? Well, if the South China Sea is resolved in favor of China, then Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean region will only increase in time. And that is something that does not sit very well with Indian thinkers. Possibility of PLA and bases. This is another thing that is often discussed in Indian maritime circles. As you know, China now has a base in Djibouti. There is an outreach to Seychelles and Maldives, where it is expected that they might have some other facility. They are not interested in building maritime bases in the Indian Ocean region. However, the thinking continues to prevail that if China has greater strength in the South China Sea, bases in the Indian Ocean region is only a matter of time. So what were the lessons that the Indian analysts and Indian thinkers learned from the Arbitral Tribunals Award in the Philippines versus China case? India realized that it is important to win both the courtroom battle as well as the ops room battle. The ops room battle meaning a metaphor for the battle between naval ships or naval presence in the South China Sea. And it was clear that while the Chinese side may not have done so well in the courtroom battle, obviously the tribunals award was against China, but it did quite well in the ops room battle, and it continues to dominate the littorals of Southeast Asia. Control of islands is really important to dominating the Asian littorals. So he who controls the islands controls the narrative. And in this case, it just happens to be China. China has control over the major islands both in the Spratlys as well as in the Parasols and on the Scarborough Shoal. Hard power measures. There is the sense that all sides resort to hard power measures, but through soft power means. So the navies are never directly involved in what happens in the South China Sea, a point that came up yesterday during discussions. It's the Coast Guard, it's the maritime militias, there are the other smaller agencies, the fishing boats that are involved in this. So you're actually using hard power measures, but through soft power means. And if this is going to be the pattern of power projection in the Indian Ocean region, then there might be a problem for India, because the Indian Navy is only used to very traditional, conventional operations. And lastly, the law is ineffective if there is no means of implementation. Again, a point that has been made clear yesterday. The Indians were very worried about the fact that despite the tribunal coming out with such a clear ruling, there has been no change in the status quo in the South China Sea. Lastly, these are my last 2 slides, Chair. I'll just take 1 minute more. And there is a middle power dilemma that all the sides are facing, that all middle powers or non-claimants are facing, and India's stand on that is particularly significant. And what India says is that, or how India sees this as, that on crucial issues of maritime governance, the big powers, the US, China, Japan, etc., have taken a very strong position. And there's very little room for compromise. And while there are various forums, there's various opportunity for all sides to speak to each other, there is very little progress made, because all the sides are sticking very rigidly to their original positions. This has created an artificial divide between the big powers, the small powers, and the middle powers. So on the one side, you have the big powers that take a hard stand, and the smaller powers and the middle powers are expected to be swing states, join one side or the other to tilt the balance of narrative on either side. This is my last slide, and this slide simply shows that, like the pirate of the Caribbean that keeps coming back, the South China Sea issues keep coming back. The South China Sea issues never get resolved, and it is for India to learn to live with the status quo of what's happening in the South China Sea, which is what it is trying to do. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Abhijit Singh. It's particularly, for most of us, interesting to hear about India as a newcomer in the South China Sea problem. It's also enlightening to see how the South China Sea fits into the India's policy amid the Look East policy, or especially the Act East policy, as it has been developing since 2014. South China Sea events are not only linked to the East China Sea, as you already know, but also to the Indian Ocean. So what's the reaction of China? We have now Dr. Deng Jianchun. He will present in the name of Shi Yinghong. So please, do you want to stand up for here? Okay. Let's go.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to deliver the presentation for Professor Shi Yinghong. It's really a pleasure to take the place for Professor Shi Yinghong to give his presentation to this conference. In his paper, Professor Shi had prepared a long paper with 6 pages, and I read his paper, and I was deeply impressed by his pessimistic feeling toward the policy adopted by the current leaders in China. I just following his paper. Since Xi Jinping took over the leadership in China, one major development has been increasingly certain. His increasing clear aspiration for expanding and enhancing China's soft power and hard power. So there are 2 categories of a major policy instrument to serve his objective. One is a strategic military, another is a strategic economy. So there are 2 pillars for the current Chinese leaders to enhance its capability in the development of its foreign policy and also its domestic policy. Roughly defining, until middle of 2014, President Xi Jinping used primary strategic military in his broad sense, building up with an even further accelerating pace China's dramatically increased strategic military capability, extending very remarkably the extent of China's maritime strategic activity, engaging vigorously in strategic military vigorously in strategic military and rivalry and competition with the U.S. Conducting intensive confrontation against Japan, taking an assertive and hardliner approach toward the South China Sea and Eastern China's dispute, accompanied by intensive military and paramilitary patrol actions. Assessing these double efforts, one can easily find that they strengthened China's hard power, extended its strategic presence, but damaged China's international soft power, complicated further its diplomatic and strategic situation, while increasing remarkably risk of confrontation with Japan as well as the United States, and promoted the further strengthening of the American strategic diplomatic rebalancing with the Japanese lifting the ban on its right of collective self-defense. Therefore, probably some review has led to the major decision of a strategic transformation in favoring strategic economy and the increasing urgent requirement for expanding demands outside for China's huge surplus production capability in the context of its slow but abundant economic downturn has made this transformation even imperative. When she believed projects of Belt and Road Initiative in nature of a strategic economy or China's leading role in establishing Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, with its headquarters in Beijing and the Third Belt Road as its primary purpose, surely in Xi Jinping's mind, and whether Beijing's suggestion of creating an enormous Asia-Pacific free trade zone or completion of FTA negotiation with the Republic of Korea and Australia, or indicates in the same direction that there is also vigorous pushing for the various projects to export China high-speed railway to numerous regions and areas outside of China. So this is the first part in Professor Shi's paper. He gave an assessment on the current leaders' policy toward the issues in the world and also at home. The second part, Professor Xi mentioned mentioned this dispute, related to the security and also to economy in Asia-Pacific region. There will be substantial costs and risks in the approach of primarily relying upon a strategic military, which lost nearly 2 years from 2014. But they have not deterred China. So this is actually an assessment by the Chinese government. There are some, deterrent forces just surrounding China, but they were not deterred. They did not deter China. A major aspect of the strategic military is still there in President Xi Jinping's fundamental posture. If one considers the remaining or even increasing complexity in his foreign policy, so this is actually a continuation of the it's the President Xi's fundamental posture in dealing with the challenges home and abroad. The dramatic and sustained build-up of China's strategic military capability still continues, even in a quicker speed, and surely will continue to be so in the predictable future. So in Professor Shi's argument, the military buildup will be continued in China, even in quicker and faster speed. And in this aspect, the world has already seen Sino-US arms race, and more broadly competition of combat capabilities over the Western Pacific region. Emerging or related to the strategic and operational weaponry in air, sea, outerspace, and cyberspace. So according to Professor Shi's prediction, the confrontation and the competition between China and the United States has been intensified in Western Pacific Ocean. Besides China's determination to develop and exert maritime power in the South China Sea and Eastern China Sea, and even in the Western Pacific, is still kept intact, with the reclamation of land for 5 to 7 reefs and the construction of aircraft runway there in Spurry Islands in a massive scale and extraordinary pace as its current primary demonstration. So this is actually a situation in the natural island of Spurry Island. Together with the development of military equipment, including missiles, advanced radar, and fighters in some islets in Spurry and Paracel, both of which took somewhat like a coup of democracy, greatly intensified the strategic rivalry with the United States to form and foment vigorous security cooperation among themselves, among the partners of the United States. Most prominently, the U.S. military freedom of navigation operation again in recent months met China's military response conducted by PRA warship and fighters, together with the dramatic beginning of China's diplomatic mobilization of foreign governments, endorsement of some elements in China's position in the South China Sea. So after the ruling of the arbitration, the target on the dispute in the South China Sea, the Chinese government immediately issued a major statement saying that the ruling actually is a piece of trash paper. And all islets within the non-dashed line are Chinese sovereign territory, together with the waters of these islets as China's territory waters. The rest of South China Sea within this line are all China's EEZ. So I think China's about comprehensive claim is based on China's historic rights. All these points, the basic logic of interaction between a rising power and an established power is worth examination. Throughout history, rising power have tended to benefit from limited plots and have therefore shown no willingness to reduce the momentum toward an ultimate conflict. And established power, with their strengths in decline, have tended to act withdraw or make limited concessions, but in many cases they have eventually fought back. Rising power have inclined toward disregarding or making light of what Karl Wing Clausewitz called culminating point of victory. established powers, on the other hand, have tended to ignore or procrastinate defining bottom line for concession. Such a scenario may begin to emerge over the South China Sea problem. So in his argument, Professor Shi is very pessimistic about the confrontation between China and the United States in the South China Sea. This is the second part. And the last part, I think Professor Shi mentioned several points. I think the main part is the major dispute in the South China Sea and China's approach to this dispute. So in the first part of his paper, Professor Shi also gave some proposals in dealing with the tangible situation in the South China Sea and in the dilemma between China and the United States. So it could be said that China's current strategy approach has become a combined and complex one. And the transformation from primary relying upon strategic military look like a strategic expansion without major retrenchment. And therefore, there are some tensions unable to be overlooked between the requirement of strategic economy and those major aspects of strategic military mentioned above, which need to be a deal with the seriously in China, to deal with the seriously in China a desirable future effort for balancing in its foreign policy. So, in short-term span of the past 3.5 years, China opened up and solidified so many new fronts or new battlefield, as it were, but none of them should have a final decision developed in the predictable future through all the possible actions and adjustment made by Beijing. A logical inference must be that China would engage in fights and campaigns in multiple fronts at the same time. Moreover, if following two trajectories would be taken into account, the situation could become even more so. First, the increasing complicated China's economy has been slowly, but in its slowed down with increasing financial precariousness in context of decreasing government revenue and increasing national debts. Second, at the same time, China's international involvement and its overseas commitment has drastically increased or intensified, accompanying with multiple external tasks which demand more Chinese national resources to deal with. The particular crucial strategy issue China now faces is whether it is able to be really aware that it should make small buys on one after another at the table and fight successively battle one after another during war. Because of the overall Chinese economic situation at home, an overall strategic center of gravity should be made and put on nowhere but maintaining the economic growth, adjusting its structure and deepening reform at home. So that what really urgent are China's domestic tasks rather than the external ones for strategic exertion to increase power influence and win glory in Asia and in the world. So according to Professor Shi's argument, the domestic issue or the domestic challenge should be put on the top agenda for the leaders of China, not the external world. Thank you.
Well, Professor, thank you very much. The audience, as you can see, has been very interested and very attentive to hear about Professor Shi's position, not only on the Chinese perception of the behavior of the US and Japan, including FONOP operations, but also the logic for the OBOR and its role for activating regional and world economy. So China's behavior in the region can be read through the lenses of realism, neorealism, offensive, defensive, but also neoliberal approach. The reasons why military buildup will continue is a very interesting topic. I'm sure that will trigger fierce discussions here. Especially reasons for upgrading military capabilities in the Paracel Islands. So no doubt this is one of the most challenging presentations in this gathering. So let me continue with the next speaker, Rear Admiral Michael McDavid, U.S. Navy, Senior Fellow, Strategic Studies Program at the Center for Naval Analysis in the U.S. He will talk about the U.S. rebalancing the South China Sea in the Asia Pacific under the new U.S. administrations. I'm sure that your presentation may have been prepared before the election, so you may have some updates on this. So please go ahead.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam and Foundation for Far East Sea Studies and the Vietnam Lawyers Association to permit me to return to Nha Trang after a 48-year absence. As indicated, my topic today was to speculate on what the new administration and their strategy might be for East Asia in particular, or in general, and South China Sea in particular. Yes, indeed, my paper was written before the election. And so with full disclosure, I'd like to say that while I supported Mrs. Clinton, I tried to be balanced in my analysis, and I'm going to continue to do so today. In fact, my presentation today will be very nonpartisan, and I want everybody to notice my red and blue tie. Definitely nonpartisan. So first, I think it's useful to remember about the time that the rebalance was announced in the fall of 2011. That was before Crimea, before Eastern Ukraine, before the emergence of ISIS, and before Russian involvement in Syria. Collectively, all of this made it seem the idea of pivoting out of the Middle East, or Europe for that matter, to Asia, makes it seem today is somewhat ludicrous. And in fact, in many ways, that's why early on the administration backed away from the term pivot and focused on the word rebalance. In other words, it was in many ways restoring the traditional balance that had marked U.S. and foreign policy and security policy for Asia for many, many decades. Second, it was rationalized primarily or as an economics or trade-driven strategy. This may come as a shock to people, but if you read President Obama's commentary or speech to the Australian Parliament in 2011 when he rolled out the rebalance, he was talking about the fact that East Asia was going to be the economic center of gravity for the 21st century, that the U.S. needed to be involved, and the key reason that U.S. needed to be involved is because he wanted to create American jobs by selling U.S. exports in Asia. That's why the attractiveness of the TPP was as a centerpiece for the rebalance strategy, is that this looked like a way to create more U.S. jobs and generate more U.S. exports to Asia. Well, the central premise of Asia remaining as the economic center of gravity for the 21st century remains, but obviously the hope for economic boost to be generated for the U.S. economy as a result of TPP has been weakened. After all, trade does go on today and TPP is not in place, but as far as the United States is concerned, TPP is dead. Now, that doesn't mean TPP less the United States could not emerge at some point using all of the other countries who have either signed on or are anxious to sign on. But at this stage of the game, it would be naive, I think, and foolish to suggest that TPP, as it's currently waiting to be implemented by the U.S. Senate or by the U.S. government, is going to go forward. I suspect that the free trade agreements that were also part of the rebalance with South Korea and Singapore are going to continue to live on. So whatever strategy for Asia the Trump administration develops, it will probably not have any new major trade agreements, but it almost certainly will have a trade focus. Mr. Trump has been very explicit on his unhappiness with our current trade situation with China. And I anticipate that on the trade front, there is going to be difficult times ahead in the U.S.-China relationship on trade issues. I also expect that the term rebalance itself is also destined to disappear into the dustbin of history. Whatever the Trump administration chooses to call its new strategy, or however it chooses to characterize its new strategy, it almost certainly will not use the word rebalance. But it is important to understand that many of the non-trade lines of policy that were embedded or embodied in the rebalance are going to live on, except for the simple reason is they have been traditional elements of U.S. Policy and security strategy in Asia since at least the Korean War. For example, the importance of alliances, especially with Japan, because its access to the bases in Japan permit the U.S. to remain forward deployed and postured militarily in Asia that it would not otherwise be able to do on a rotational basis. And of course, that is why the EDCA with the Philippines is so important, is because it provides rotational access to Philippine bases for U.S. forces. And obviously the Pentagon and I suspect the Trump administration will hope that will live on and that President Duterte will not cancel it. The second aspect of traditional policy, if you will, is the importance of relationships with other regional powers other than our allies. Obviously China, more recently India, and Indonesia and Vietnam. Thirdly, freedom of the seas. Again, this has been a traditional aspect of U.S. policy for many decades. In this regard, I wanted to remind everybody to what I consider the single best statement of policy that came out of the Obama administration regarding the South China Sea. It's very simple. The United States will sail or fly wherever international law permits. This is not only a statement of intent, but it also carries an implied postscript. And if you want to try to stop us, you're going to have to use force to do so. And so whether a Trump administration will continue to use the phrase sailing or flying wherever international law permits, I would say that it will probably, something along those lines will be forthcoming. Rules-based approaches to strategy and policy have been, again, a factor for U.S. policy for many decades, because the argument is that following the rules creates stability, and stability is a sine qua non for economic development. Next, two specific deterrence missions will continue to be part and parcel of U.S. strategy in Asia. One, deterring another North Korean attempt to invade the Republic of Korea. That mission continues. And the second one would be to deter an attempt by the PRC to use military force to unify with Taiwan across the Taiwan Straits. Now, before somebody jumps up and shoots at me, I understand that China has a peaceful policy focused on reunification and is not interested in using force, but nonetheless, the fact that force remains on the table as far as Beijing is concerned The U.S. has to consider that it has a deterrent role to play because of the Taiwan Relations Act. And finally, a staple of U.S. policy toward the region has been to foster democratic norms. Now, admittedly, this has waxed and waned over the decades depending upon the interest of the administration, but I think that in general term that has been, you could draw a consistent line of an approach toward encouraging and doing what the U.S. can, nagging, whatever it takes to try to foster democratic norms. Besides free trade agreements, I think another big difference between the Obama administration and the Trump administration is going to be high-level U.S. involvement. In the many multilateral meetings that have sprung up over the years, I just have a hard time seeing President Trump traveling to Asia twice a year for the East Asia Summit in APEC. I would say that I expect the Trump administration to revert to the norm, which is certainly not the Obama administration. There are his many trips to Asia, but perhaps one U.S. visitation or one U.S. president trip to Asia annually, if at best. So it's going to decline. And how that plays, particularly within the ASEAN role and the habits that ASEAN has become accustomed to over the last 8 years, it needs to be taken into account when you think about expectations for the Trump administration. When you think about it, no matter who was going to win the election, there are some security issues that they're going to inherit, no matter whether it was Mrs. Clinton or now President-elect Trump. Number one, of course, is North Korea's drive to develop a deliverable nuclear weapon on the end of an ICBM. In other words, Pyongyang has made it perfectly clear through threats among several times repeated that they have the ambition to be able to reach out and touch New York City with a nuclear weapon. This is probably going to come to a head during the Trump administration. So this is going to be a serious issue because the intelligence community is already tap dancing around saying, well, we have to take a worst case assumption that we already think that they have a deliverable nuclear weapon. The only thing left is a demonstration of an ICBM that will fly far enough. Now, one thing a Trump administration can do is reverse North Korean thinking that somehow they have managed to deter the United States. When you talk to North Koreans, and I was fortunate enough to be at a conference in Switzerland a month ago when we had 4 North Korean officials participated, they have persuaded themselves that the United States has been deterred by their nuclear posture. And I think one of the things that a Trump administration would bring to the table is to undo the perceived weakness of the U.S. extended nuclear umbrella. Whether intended or not, and I'm sure it was not, but the combination of Mr. Obama's Prague speech in 2009, followed by the nuclear posture review the same year, that was focused on reducing the salience of nuclear weapons in U.S. strategy, has convinced not only some of our potential foes like North Korea, but our allies such as Japan and North Korea to question the credibility of the U.S. extended nuclear umbrella. And so that's one of the things that Mr. Trump can bring to the table, I think. Number 2, there's going to be a continued long-term competition between the U.S. and China. We have competing operational concepts. China's putting in place, U.S. has called it A2AD. The Chinese sometimes refer to it as counter-intervention. But the bottom line is, it's trying to put in place military capabilities that in case of conflict can keep the U.S. as far away from East Asia and China as possible. In return, the United States, of course, has a competing response operational concept, which is based upon making sure that China can't do that. So what you have is a competition between operational concepts, denying access versus assuring access, that has been going on since the later years of the George W. Bush administration and are certain to continue into the Trump administration. Thirdly, the whole range of Taiwan's issues with regard to Taiwan and the mainland. Obviously, there's already a growing tension because of the DPP electoral victory in last year, and the fact that Madam Tsai, the current president of Taiwan, has not been willing to say the magic words "One China" or agree in the One China understanding that was reached in Singapore. And so we see that there is a growing, I don't want to say tension, but at least a toughness in the rhetoric coming out of Beijing. And if you combine that with the fact that many of the potential Republican officials who could be appointed to a Trump administration who are known to be very favorable to Taiwan, if you mix trade with China problems, cross-strait problems with not getting on with reunification, or at least discussions with reunification, with Trump officials in the Department of Defense or in the State Department who are more predisposed to look favorably on Taiwan, that also is a potentially interesting brew that could raise some issues. In number 4, I would list maritime disputes. The Yellow Sea, I think, is probably the most dangerous, where the North Koreans and South Korean navies are liable to start shooting at each other over blue crabs, blue crab fishing in what they call the West Sea. The East China Sea, with regard to the Senkakus, which also involves the potential for a U.S.-China conflict because the U.S. security treaty to Japan covers the Senkakus. And then finally the South China Sea, in that order. In the South China Sea, I expect what some have characterized as the ritualized patterns of patrols and protests are going to continue. In other words, we're going to see more of the same.
Can we wrap up the discussion?
To wrap up,
Yep.
TPP is dead, but trade is not. Rebalance as a characterization is gone, but many elements of continuity with traditional U.S. policy with Asia will remain. We have difficult problems to solve that the Trump administration will inherit, the most serious being North Korea. And enthusiasm for Asia multilateralism, or at least U.S. participation in Asian multilateralism, is waning. But the real bottom line is it really is too soon to tell. So don't pay any attention to what I've told you. The people who Mr. Trump selects and put in key policy positions are going to shape the future. And the one thing I guess that would concern me is the style of Mr. Trump is going to have to change, otherwise there's liable to be chaos. Because whatever presidents say is always taken literally in the U.S. policy establishment. And if you have a tweet a day from the White House, that may or may not be focused on an issue or change of policy, that's going to create chaos in the policy apparatus. And of course, the rest of the world has a vote. Strategy is never a game of solitaire. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Admiral McDavid, for your analysis on several relevant issues regarding the U.S. and in Asia, especially that rebalancing is a comeback to the region, nothing new, but also the green future of the rebalancing. But on the other side, it's very interesting the way you dissected the core components of the rebalancing and those elements that will prevail. It's very interesting to hear about the clearliness of the U.S. intentions to continue fund-up operations in the area. And overall, the analysis on how future President Trump will conduct its policy in Asia and how to deal with the current challenges, including North Korea. So let's move on to the final presenter, Dr. Tran Viet Thai. He's a Deputy Director General at the Institute of Foreign Policy and Strategic Studies at the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. His presentation is on the South China Sea and ASEAN unity diversity, the role, expectations, and adaptations. Please.
Thank you, Chair. As the last speaker, I'm going to try to be as short and concise as possible. In my presentation, the topic is about South China Sea and ASEAN unity and diversity. I would like to present to you the 4 points. Point number 1, I would like to look back the last 50 years of ASEAN to see what are the most successful story of ASEAN and what are the biggest challenges ASEAN is facing. Looking back to the past 50 years, I can summarize the 4 important achievements of ASEAN. Number 1 is that the biggest achievement ASEAN has so far is that maintaining peace and stability relatively in the region, which is ridden with a lot of armed conflicts in the past 50 years. The second story is that ASEAN has harnessed successfully a lot of external sources for its social and economic developments. These are already also very important in contributing to maintaining peace and stability, especially among ASEAN countries. And the third one, very important, is that it has built many mechanisms and tools, actually, to deal with regional issues or challenges. And many of them have been using for Asia-Pacific regions, or have been open for Asia-Pacific regions. So the last important and successful story of ASEAN is that it is also catering services to broader regions in Asia, in East Asia and Asia-Pacific regions. But along with these 4 important successful stories, ASEAN is also facing 2 biggest things or challenges. I think it needs to devise a capability to adapt to it. Number 1 is South China Sea. Of course, this is the topic we are talking about today. But the second one I would like to mention is that non-traditional security threats. If you look back the past 50 years, ASEAN has been, I think, very concerned with the government-led processes. And ASEAN countries have paid a lot of attention to its independence or its sovereignty, so on like that. But in the next 50 years, or in the years to come, at least, non-traditional securities and non-state actors are intervening more and more in this process, and ASEAN need to devise new ways of dealing with these challenges. In the second part of my presentation, I would like to mention about the changing nature of South China Sea. South China Sea dispute have been here for many decades, but the nature of South China Sea issues have been changed substantially, especially in 2016. Before 1990s, the dispute was mainly among China and some claimants, and mostly related to occupying some features. But since 1990s and 2010, the scope was expanded, and it became regional security issues among China and ASEAN. But since 2010, especially in 2016, the nature of South China Sea issues have been further expanded. It is not only the territorial dispute among some certain countries in ASEAN and China. It is also not only regional security issues, but it also become an issue of global governance, where G7 made statement, where the PCA or the arbitration court made wordings about it. So I can summarize the nature or the scope of South China Sea in these following things. So the intensity of the issue or the number of incidents in South China Sea continue to be expanded. The scope and concerned parties continue to increase, especially the engagement and intervention of major powers, which make things very difficult for ASEAN countries. The trends of militarizations and paramilitarizations continue to increase. This is really different from the rest of other disputes in the region. And it is also a big challenge to the international law, why regional solutions have not been so much useful. The third part of my presentation is about touching the tools and roles of ASEAN. During the past 2 decades, ASEAN is trying to use various tools to deal with that. One of them is DOC. Another one is hotline. These things prove to be not so effective, especially about DOC. Even DOC was devised 2000 or more than 10 years ago, but it took 9 years. It took 9 years for 10 ASEAN countries and China to build the guidelines for implementing it, but then it led to nowhere. The same, many hotlines have been set up, but when the situation is hot, the light never hot. This is big problems. But recently, ASEAN countries, the Philippines initiate the legal process in South China Sea. But actually, the fact that it is the Philippines who initiate, but it is the Philippines who seems to not using it after the successful conclusion of the PCA, it is also challenging the law. So it leads to uncertainty everywhere. So the role of ASEAN during the past 2 decades, I can summarize, mostly dialogues and confidence building. ASEAN show high capability in adapting to changes across the region and in the world, but it showed its weaknesses in effectively managing or solving the territorial dispute. Looking back to the ASEAN's records about dealing with territorial dispute, there are many territorial disputes among ASEAN countries still remain. Some has been solved through legal process, for example, between Singapore and Malaysia, but only when with the consent of concerned parties. So the last part of my presentation about expectation for ASEAN. Along with the key expectation for ASEAN is that it can continue to show its high capability in adapting to challenges and managing the emergencies or dispute. But we expect ASEAN can devise new tools, 2 things. We expect 2 things from ASEAN. One is new tools can be devised for ASEAN. And one of the new tools we are expecting is that we can apply Q, not only for the naval forces, but also for Coast Guard. This is really important because the game here in the region is not only naval forces, but also Coast Guard. And we should develop the Q, Convention on Unexpected Encounters at Sea, for Coast Guard. This is really important. Another new tool, very much needed, is rapid response or crisis management capability. ASEAN need to have some forces on the water to see what happened, to know what happened and then to coordinate policy among countries. And the second and my last expectation is about strengthen ASEAN in 2 terms. A strengthened leadership, a better capability to deal with challenges from security and development sectors. So I think I stop here. I try to be short for you to have Q&A, and I'm ready to entertain all of you in Q&A section. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tran. You have cleared the landscape of how ASEAN faces important challenges, South China Sea, non-traditional security threats, non-state actors Also, you portray very clearly the way this conflict has been internationalized, new aspects of the issue, like global governance, how APEC, G20, G7, PCA has been clearly involved now in the South China Sea conflict. Important also is your view of the role of international law in solving conflicts in the area. So this process of DOC guidelines and the possible COC. Lastly, the role of ASEAN, how ASEAN might be fostering dialogue, producing more CBMs, and those new tools needed, like US and strong leadership. So thank you very much for your presentation. Well, now I should open the floor for a Q&A session. So let me see. If possible, please refrain your comments to very short time. We need questions to be addressed by the panel. So, okay, we have one here, the next one. We'll check in
yes.
3 questions at a time.
Yes. Thank you very much. My name is Vladimir Yevseyev from Russian Institute for Commonwealth Countries. I have 2 questions. One question to speaker from India. Next year, India will be a member of Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So, in my view, it is a good idea if you're using potential of Shanghai Cooperation Organization for solving not only problem between India and Pakistan. We may to using potential of Shanghai Cooperation Organization for solving problem in South China Sea too. So, and additional, we have a special format to cooperation between Russia, India, and China. And you know that maybe this format will be using to solve this problem too. For not solving, maybe for find compromise between country in South China Sea. My second question to American speaker. You know that Russia have a good experience for solving military conflict, and we sometimes may find very difficult, we may to find compromise very difficult partner. For example, Turkey. Turkey is difficult partner not only for Russian Federation. Of course, but I hope that we may to find compromise with United States in Syria. We may to find compromise with United States in Afghanistan and nowhere.
So what's your question,
And
sir?
so my question, what do you think about opportunities to using new regional security system in South China Sea on sectoral basis? We are beginning to find bilateral cooperation between countries after then united in creating one regional system with help of Russian Federation and United States. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a second question here. Please, if you are brief, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. My name is Tung from the DAV. I have 2 short questions.
Please.
I think for Mike. My first question is about ASEAN centrality. We have been familiar with that term. So what do you think ASEAN centrality as a terminology would be in the new administration? Is it that or is it gone? My second question relates to the TPP. Do you think that TPP somehow can live on without the United States? Actually, TPP was signed among the 5 countries without the United States in the first place. So is it okay for the United States to stay outside the TPP and Japan, Vietnam, and other countries to go with it?
Thank you. We have a third one, and we continue with another round.
Thank you. I must say that all presentations are very clear, but they give me a very confusing, unclear, and unpredictable vision of what's going to happen in Asia in the Trump administration. I have a couple of questions. Question number 1, is that when Mr. Singh talked about Indian policy, he started with being an honest broker. But as it goes on, it looked like Indian becoming more participant rather than honest broker. For being an honest broker, you need two protagonists. If because of Asian policy or because of domestic influence in America or combination of both, the American lower its profile, at least in the South China Sea.
Okay, let's continue with the answers.
So how is the honest broker? I have a few questions.
All right.
I mentioned that.
So I
that
think-
question addressed to Mr. Singh. Second question, I said to Mr. C, I hope that somebody can answer that. There's one particular statement I'm very concerned. I have listened to Mr. C before, and he said, and we repeat here, that the rest of the sea within the 9-dash line are old China EEZ. I have looked several times at the major statement, official statement of the Chinese government. I don't see that. So can somebody in China confirm that this is a correct interpretation?
Sir, yes, thank you. We have to stop and continue with some answers.
I still have a question for Mr.
Yeah, I will stop here because we have many other questions in the floor. Please.
Well, I think I got it right, the question for me from our Russian friend about a security system for the South China Sea. Was that the thrust of your question? I think, and my impression is that anytime somebody from Europe comes to Asia and talks about security systems, you get an immediate pushback from Asians who say, we don't need any instruction from Europeans on how to do security in East Asia. Whether that's fair or not, that tends to be, at least that's the normal reaction that I've experienced. So there's an automatic antibody for anybody saying, well, look how well we've done in Europe. Why can't you Asians get on board and do it the same way we have? And so I would never want to say never, but I don't see any kind of a security system for the South China Sea in the immediate future. And I think it would be, once again, any kind of a system without any ability to establish rules and establish enforcement would be gilding the lily. And in fact, the one security system that I think everybody in ASEAN is counting on is finally to get a code of conduct, a COC that actually has some teeth in it. But once again, how do you get a COC with teeth in it that everybody will sign up to abide by? So that's what the delay is. I hope I got the question right. If I got it wrong, I apologize. And the other question I had was ASEAN centrality in the new administration. I don't know. In a long sweep of the difference between Democrats and Republicans when you talk about Asia's security, the Republicans have always been more skeptical of multilateral security devices in Asia and have tended to want to focus strictly on the bilateral treaty arrangements that we have and other bilateral understandings. I don't think anybody would push back against ASEAN centrality, and I don't know that anybody would warmly embrace it. I think it's liable to be ignored. It's liable to be embraced. We have pieces in place now, a U.S. ambassador to ASEAN that we didn't have before in a Republican administration. We are a member of the EAS now, and we've had 8 years of dramatic participation. So even if the president himself doesn't show up, I suspect that the professionals in the Department of State and Department of Defense will continue to participate in these very important meetings. but you have to be aware there's liable to be high-level frustration of a lot of talk but no action.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Michael. Abhijit, do you have to,
Yeah, thank you.
would like to address questions?
Those are actually two questions for me. And let me at the outset make it clear that Asia is complex, and this was a point that I was trying to make yesterday also, in one sense that the politics of territorial Asia, which is land Asia, is very different from the politics of maritime Asia. On the land, for instance, India does have a lot of understanding with Russia, China, not so much Pakistan, but a lot of states with which it probably doesn't see eye to eye in the seas. So this question of the SCO that you had raised, well, the India might be given or has been given membership of the SCO, and so will Pakistan, but that's not a forum in which India sees the India-Pakistan problem being resolved. And really politically there is a sense that China is closer to Pakistan and that it will always support Pakistan's interests. It's like an all-weather friend. And Russia is not a country that will ever be willing to play broker between India and Pakistan. And the Indians have also made it clear that we don't need a broker, neither the US nor the Russians or anyone else. So I don't think the SCO is a good forum in which these political differences that are there between India and Pakistan can be solved. But it is certainly a forum in which the Indians are showing some solidarity with the Chinese and with the Russians, and there's many forums in which we're actually dealing with the Chinese. There's the BRICS forum. We're also part of the AIIB. So this is not to say that India and China don't agree on all matters. In maritime Asia, as I was mentioning, things are more complex because there are disputes, there are claims and counterclaims, there's maritime operations in the open seas. That makes things very complicated. So the SCO question might not be related to what's happening in the seas. But this gets me to the second question that you were asking about India being an honest broker. The problem with being an honest broker is that there is this assumption that the disputing sides or the claimants are willing to negotiate. That is not sadly the case. Many of these sides, as I was mentioning, have taken very rigid positions, and this is a game of leverages. Each one is trying to maximize his position. Here, I think, it is important even for the brokers to draw some red lines to say that certain things on principle are acceptable, certain things aren't acceptable. And that's what India does. So when India talks about freedom of navigation, the right to unimpeded commerce, the need to resolve the disputes peacefully, it is in a manner of speaking drawing some red lines for everyone to say that please don't resort to force. Similarly, in the Indian Ocean region, which is clearly a theater of a space of Indian influence, India does see some red lines being crossed when there are, say, Chinese submarines that come and berth in Sri Lanka or in Pakistan. This is too close to the Indian mainland. This is very clearly an Indian littoral. So it's very hard for India to play honest broker or a mediator in this. All India can do is protect its own interests and also have a voice on the international stage to say that there's certain things that can be done and there are other things that can't. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Abhijit. Dr. Tran, would you like to address questions for you? Do you have to address something, Professor Tang? Your personal view? You don't have to justify Dr. Shi's paper.
How can I say? I think the paper prepared by Professor Shi just gave another school of ideas on the situation in the South China Sea. This is actually very important for the Chinese government to think about their policy toward the dispute in this region. And also, I think our leaders have already got some ideas from this response to have a more careful policy toward the ASEAN countries, toward the United States and also toward dispute in this region. This is actually a strategic transformation. I'd like to use the strategic phrase to describe the current situation in China. Actually, to my understanding, the cooperation and the competition between China and the United States has been intensified in recent years. In economy, China proposed several initiatives and also established the AIIB. This is a competition in economy, in trade, and in security. The response to the so-called freedom of navigation by the United States, especially when the U.S. destroyers, came to the relevant waters in the South China Sea. The Chinese Navy gave very strong response, sometimes 2 or 3 fighting vessels just following the U.S. destroyer. But I'm not so pessimistic on side. This reminded me of a conference held in Canberra last March. And Admiral Swift also delivered a speech in the conference. After his speech, I asked him a question. I asked that the U.S. aircraft carrier battle group was surrounded by Chinese fighting vessels in the South China Sea. He said yes. And I asked again, what is your take on these activities by the Chinese Navy? He used 2 phrases, 2 words. The first is very professional. The second is very active. To my understanding, very professional because the 2 sides, the 2 navies, especially the captains of these fighting vessels, they have to study the MOUs in encountering in the high sea, and they're quite familiar with the procedure of the encountering, and they opened their common channel to talk about even where are you going, where from, and so I think because of these arrangements, I mean the MOUs, the 2 navies did have very good exchanges on site. And active, I used to work in the South China Sea Fleet headquarters in 1980s. And during that time, when our fighting vessels met the U.S. fighting vessels in the South China Sea as well, the U.S. fighting vessels would, ask a lot of questions, and even they used the signals, flag and some other signals to the Chinese fighting vessel. The Chinese fighting vessel did not give any response. So this time, I think Chinese Navy has become very active. So to my understanding, the 2 words, professional, means the 2 sides, I mean the 2 navies do have their good exchanges in the meeting, especially in the high sea. And second, the active Chinese Navy this time has become very active in the exchanges with their counterpart from the United States. So I'm quite optimistic on the encountering between the 2 navies, and I don't think there is a large possibility for the 2 countries to have a clash, direct clash on site. This is actually a political game played by the 2 countries. It's also a game played by the media and by the public.
Professor Deng, thank you very much. We don't want to neglect a U.S. deep concern on this issue, so I would like to ask Michael to address this.
Just 2 seconds. I would just like to reinforce the comments that you just heard. I had the opportunity to talk to the commander of the USS Stennis strike group that spent 65 days sailing around in the vicinity of Scarborough Shoal this spring, and he was, without exception, said PLA Navy activity and what have you was highly professional, non-provocative, and what have you. So it was, as you just heard, I just wanted to reinforce that point.
Okay, thank you very much. We have time for another round of questions. Please stand. And then we have two questions here. Yeah, two gentlemen over here. Please, starting with Stein.
Stein Tønneson, Peace Research Institute, Oslo, Norway. Two questions for Michael McDevitt. The first concerns the strategic military value, advantages and disadvantages of holding positions in the Spratlys. Your paper contains some interesting observations on this on pages 12 to 13 that you had no time to talk about, but I think it's particularly interesting in our context to hear something about that. The second question is outside of what your paper dealt with, but I am just curious to hear your view on the recent scenario study published by RAND Corporation and commissioned, I think, by the US Army about the coming war between China and the United States, where they argue that it will not be a land war, not a nuclear exchange, but also not a short war, but a longer war because the United States needs to bring in more weapons for the exchange with China. Was it wise to publish this kind of report? And what do you think about the contents? Thank you.
Thank you, Stein. We just have 10 minutes, so please keep short your comments and just questions. Any of you can.
I'll yield my time happily to the U.S. State Department.
All right.
Thank you. This is Tim Liston. I'm the Deputy Consul General at our consulate in Ho Chi Minh City. Previously, I was in Hanoi as Deputy Political Chief and handled the South China Sea as one in my portfolio. I just wanted to thank you, the presenters today, for raising some very important issues, as well as yesterday. There was a lot of food for thought. Just a very quick couple points. First, I'd caution on any speculation right now about what's going to happen in 11 weeks with the transition of power between the Obama administration and the President-elect Trump administration. There's a whole transition team underway with the bureaucracy engaging in terms of transition papers and policy papers. One great thing about a big bureaucracy is that it tends to steer some of the edges into more of a mainstream policy. One, I think, a clear example, and we have gone through many transitions of power between administrations, is East Asia and in Southeast Asia. Our interests have not changed very, very much over the past several decades. They will remain constant, as will our presence in this region. The plying of the seas by the 7th Fleet has delivered prosperity through the peace and stability that it has brought. This we don't foresee in changing. Admiral, I wonder if you got some of my talking points, because many of the issues you hit on the strategic rebalance and the freedom of navigation are completely 100% what I would have said. One thing I would challenge you on is the fact that TPP is dead. I would just like to quote Secretary Kerry, who gave during his press conference in New Zealand last week. He said the current administration remains deeply committed to the agreement. He says basically the fact that it may or may not be taken up in the lame duck session isn't dispositive of where the U.S. may go with this issue.
So what's your question, sir?
There is no question.
Okay.
The question is, the question I had, or actually the comment, is that stay tuned. These things that have brought prosperity here, the tenets of TPP, will continue. And if I do have a question for Dr. T, I would wholeheartedly agree with your rapid response force. I'm just wondering how best to effectively make that happen in terms of within ASEAN. Do you add a component? Do you make it an ASEAN +3, +1? How do we make that happen? Because it's a very fascinating and very important idea as we move into the next decades of the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for one more question here. Yeah, go ahead, sir.
I'm Chin from the Maritime Institute of Malaysia. I would disagree to Dr. Tran's saying that hotline is not effective. As a practitioner myself, I've used hotline many, many times, and I find it very useful. But the thing is that to make it happen, both sides has to be playing their roles. For example, we do have hotlines between Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand. I think we have started with Vietnam, if I'm not mistaken. If both parties are genuinely using this line, it is going to be a very effective tool. And we have resolved many, many issues using hotlines. So I feel that hotline is an important tool where you can use it as a tool for immediate communications between two parties, if anything arises that need immediate actions.
Thank you very much. Would you like to address that?
Yeah, maybe among ASEAN countries, the hotline is sometimes useful, but especially between China and Vietnam or China to some ASEAN countries. When we need to talk, it's no use. It's not in use. This is a big problem for us. And when China wants to talk, they try for every way to find out appropriate person to talk. So this is sometimes one way rather than two way. It's a big problem when it's not about solving. It's about making communication works. Thank you.
Okay, Michael, there are a lot of questions for you.
Quickly here, on the Spratlys, the argument I made in my paper is fairly straightforward. Is the size of those enhancements, the creation of these artificial islands. You have to actually, they're not little specks in the sand anymore. These are very big facilities, and they have, while they don't have military forces on them today, or they may have small garrisons, but they don't have fighter aircraft and missiles and anti-ship cruise missiles and what have you. All of those things can be flown in or shipped in virtually overnight. The harbors in most of those islands are bigger than Pearl Harbor. If you superimpose a satellite photograph of Pearl Harbor and look at Subi Reef or Fiery Cross, the harbors there are actually larger than Pearl Harbor. So these are not trivial little facilities. And my assessment of why China did that is this gives them the ability, in case of a conflict, that they can put about 72 to 100 tactical aircraft in the southern part of the South China Sea and be able to try to establish air control over the southern half of the South China Sea. And with the missiles and SAMs, where then they would have a hope of being able to defend themselves. So in case of a conflict, in fact, that China would be able to control, because they already have de facto control over the northern half of the South China Sea between Hainan and the Paracels, the facilities there. This gives them the ability to essentially maintain control over the entire South China Sea in times of conflict. In terms of the RAND study on the U.S. Army, I'm tempted to say the answer to your question is, who was the sponsor? It was the U.S. Army. They're looking for work in Asia, and so I did not read that in the studies in great detail. I thought it was actually absolutely incredibly irresponsible to have a study that talks about specific scenarios out and how you would do X, Y, or Z, publish that in the open source, which gives you an indication if it's open source and unclassified, it's probably fanciful.
Professor Deng, would you like to address?
Actually, we are facing a very specific moment in the South China Sea. The competition has been intensified. The cooperation, I'm sure, also has been intensified in recent years. For example, the cooperation between China and ASEAN countries. So we should have a new vision toward the dispute in this regard. For example, can we share our security in this region? Can we share our economy in this region? This is a very important time. This is not a zero-sum game, especially between China and the United States. We should share our commitment, share our achievements in this area.
Okay. Would you like to ask questions?
Thank you. Christian Muller, Danish Embassy. Two very brief questions. One is for Dr. Tung. That is the PCA award. What is the discussion on that in China? I mean, not on the status and the format of it, but the very content from the tribunal. And then my other question is
can you speak louder, please?
Yes.
Yeah, closer. Can you rephrase the question, please?
Yes. In China, what is the discussion on the content of the PCA award? I mean, not the status or the format of it, but is there any discussion of the content? And then my other question is for Dr. Tang from DAV. That is, if you could elaborate a little bit on what you said on the need for a stronger leadership within ASEAN, who that should come from, and would it be the whole ASEAN or maritime or littoral states ASEAN?
Get a stronger leadership at ASEAN, and the first questions, maybe you might.
Point, please. Can you, I beg pardon? Can you say again? I didn't.
So what was your first question?
Sorry.
Sorry.
That was on the PCA award. The discussions in China.
What was the discussion, the content of the discussions, whether they were...
the content of the award.
Yep.
I think this is a very complicated response from the Chinese side. At the official level, we denied all the ruling award of the arbitration. Some scholars said this might be a chance. Only a small group of our experts, in such an argument. But for most of the Chinese experts and scholars said this is a ridiculous ruling because, for example, the ruling just to take Taiping Island as a rock. It's really unlogical ruling by the court. So this is actually response. The main part of the response from the Chinese academic circle. And our government, of course, I'm not spokesman for our government, they denied all the ruling of the arbitration. But the scholars there should be some discussions on the possibility if China can change a little bit of its attitude toward the lawsuit like the arbitration in China.
Dr. Trang, how do you see the strong leadership in ASEAN?
Thank you. 4 points. Point number 1, we need a stronger leadership in ASEAN in 4 terms. Number 1, we need new ideas and the persons, a stronger leader who can lead in discussion, who can lead in making commitment and implementing commitment. Number 2, we need someone who can harmonize national interests of member countries at this moment in ASEAN. Number 3, we want to see a quicker and timely response of ASEAN in crisis or in emergencies. And the last one, that we need someone who can help ASEAN balance among major powers when they engage more and more in the region. Okay. This is what we think in mind.
May I ask a short question for Professor Song? You asked the microphone.
Ian Hui Song from Academia Sinica in Taipei. My question is addressed to Admiral McDavid. I wonder if you have been following the remarks made by Republican Senator Jeff Sessions and House Speaker Gingrich. If those 2 persons were appointed as the Secretary of State and the Defense Secretary, do you think the U.S. involvement in the South China Sea will increase or decrease? Thank you.
Michael?
As a general proposition, I would argue that Mr. Trump's business history suggests that he doesn't like to lose, that he's very competitive, but he's also very transactional. That's in a business sense. How that translates to strategic guidance and people that are put in charge is quite of large bureaucracies is an altogether different story. And that's why I say I really don't know. If Mr. Gingrich got a position in the cabinet, if nothing else, it would be entertaining.
Yes, please.
To my knowledge, I think Mr. Donald Trump lost 2 lawsuits with China. One was in 1990s with the Hong Kong businessman, and another is I think should be last year because of the trademark. You know, some netizen just registered the TRUMP as on the website as a trademark, and Mr. Trump carried out the lawsuit against that gentleman, and he failed. So, in terms of the lawsuit with China, Mr. Trump at least lost 2 lawsuits. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Session 5 time is over. Any other questions, you can address the panelists. So a big applause for everybody. Thank you very much.